All right, has everybody gotten a notification that this is being recorded? Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Cheeseman, and I'm a policy manager with Prosperity Indiana. I joined the team a little over 2 months ago. And this is the first installment in our three-part series called Advocacy 101. This is a series that we do annually, and we make it available to the public because we want to educate and empower advocates around the state to engage with their lawmakers in productive conversations to promote the financial and economic welfare of Indiana's people and places and households. So we can hop to the next slide. And as a housekeeping note, feel free to go ahead and drop your name and your organization into the chat, just so we can say hello and see who all is here and you all can connect with each other. If you also want to reference where you're working from, just so people can get a sense of the regions that are represented here today, that will give you all the opportunity to connect with folks either working in similar sectors or in, geographically close to you. So we can move to the next one. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Prosperity Indiana, we are a statewide association of individuals, organizations, and institutions that are focused on community-based economic development. So we engage with our members through what we call our REAP framework. Across the state, there are about 200 organizations, and you can see in the bottom right of this slide that it includes everything from banks, housing authorities, city governments, United Ways, to affordable housing developers, community development corporations, and other healthcare organizations as well. We are represented in pretty much all counties, and you can see the breakdown over in that pie chart on the left. There's a lot of nonprofit organizations, public organizations, private organizations, and again, people who choose to join the network as individuals so they can participate in our advocacy efforts in their personal capacity. So our REAP framework includes resources, engagement, advocacy, and programs. We are here talking primarily about the A in our REAP framework, and that is where we speak directly to lawmakers about the issues and, yes, at times, specific legislation that affects our members, the communities that we operate in, and also the people that we serve and the people that we are. So that is a little bit of an overview of Prosperity Indiana. If you are curious to learn more about how our association functions, I encourage you to reach out to me after the webinar, and I can answer your questions as best I can, or I can also connect you to our engagement manager, and she can kind of give you a more thorough rundown of who we are and how we operate. We can move to the next slide. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it to Andrew. He will fill in any gaps from my kind of overview of what Prosperity is and who we are. And then he'll take you into the content of today's presentation, which is all about sort of the rules surrounding advocacy and how we can operate within those rules and guidelines as we work to engage our lawmakers. So Andrew, thank you so much. I will hand it over to you to introduce yourself, and I will start letting people in and watch in the lobby.
All right. Thanks so much, Rachel, and welcome everybody. Thank you for taking time on a very cold and windy Friday afternoon in January. As people were joining on, they said January can be even more busy than December. One of the busiest times of year, certainly for our advocacy work here at Prosperity Indiana. So appreciate you taking some time to talk about Advocacy 101. And building on what Rachel was talking about, advocacy is a key part of what we call our REAP framework that we provide to members. It's a key function of us advocating on behalf of our shared network for our members, for the community economic development sector. And as you can see here on the screen, what we're trying to do here is, yes, we're starting this three-part series talking about the rules of advocacy, and then we're going to talk more about the strategy, that's the 201, and the experience 301. But I want to kind of center exactly how we're talking about the rules today. If there's anybody here who's been part of one of these series before, please raise your hand, either on screen or with the little emoji function at the top. I don't know if anybody is coming back and joining us for this particular series from a previous year. I'm not seeing anybody, so that tells me that we have first timers here. That's good to know. And that's really what we wanted to focus this version this year on, is really focusing on, yes, we want to give you an idea of the rules, but what we're not doing, I am not a lobbying attorney, so I'm not giving any legal advice today. And I'm not really, we don't want to focus on so much of the technical aspects as we want to talk about why lobbying is important and give you a framework so that you can be comfortable beginning a lobbying journey. So that's, I'm assuming that we have folks here that may have participated in some lobbying or advocacy, but you're here and you want to get a sense for what can you do and how you can get the most out of your advocacy. And the photo that we have here is we are not expecting you to jump straight into a meeting with Senator Todd Young. That's what we're not saying that by the end of this discussion or our three-part series that you're necessarily going to be in a place where you're going to jump right into that. If you could think about what we're talking about today as more of a couch to 5K, we want to make sure that you are comfortable using your experience and your voice, and we're going to talk through some of that process. So let's go next to the idea of why advocate. Why is that important? So let me take a second and ask people, let's hear from you why you think advocacy is important or could be important to the work you do. So we have a small enough group. Feel free to put in an answer in the chat or raise your hand. We could talk for a minute. I want to get a sense for what you're coming in thinking why that could be important. And then we'll talk about what we hear from our members as well. I see a couple of people are typing. Let me give you just a second. Anybody else, feel free to come off mute. This is a good chance for you to tell us. We are the voice for those who we serve. Yeah, I think that's great. That's about as good of an answer as we get, but let's see what else people think. Lori says, to better represent and support those who we serve. Yeah, very good. Got a few more here. Lawmakers are often not experts on the topic and need to be educated. Scott and I have talked, and so I think he's very much in line. You're going to hear some echoes of that here in just a minute. Tyler says, the more I know, the more I can better support the young people we support using their voices. Tracy says, building on Cody's response, we are the voice for others who often have no voice. And then I see from Monica, advocacy is beyond being a voice. It is teaching individuals to find their voice and use it effectively. Okay, everybody understands. I think we're done here because you all get it. No, I think very much in line with what we tell our members and our coalition partners. So let me show you a few of the things that I wrote down. So this isn't necessarily comprehensive, but these are reasons why to advocate. So above all, policymakers need good information about what's happening in their districts to make sound policy decisions about what affects their districts and the state as a whole. And I will say, I'll step back. We'll talk some about federal advocacy, but a lot of what we're talking in particular, the Indiana General Assembly is happening right now. So we're kind of thinking mainly in terms of state level advocacy, although some of these lessons certainly apply to local and federal advocacy as well. But that basic principle stands true. Policymakers can't make good decisions unless they have good information. And we, the members of Indiana's community economic development sector, we are the subject matter experts when it comes to those issues that affect the people that we serve. Like so many of you in the comments said that. Rachel, a couple of slides ago, showed you who PI's members are. If you are from one of those type of organizations, our policymakers need to hear from you, because if they're not hearing from you, then their decisions aren't being informed by the type of perspectives that Prosperity Indiana's members have, and also the clients and the people who are affected by policies. So we certainly do what we can to bring in the voice of individuals impacted by policies. But as you see in the picture here, the General Assembly meets, Monday through Thursdays from, maybe about 8 a.m. to 3 or 4 p.m. And if you don't get there during those times, or if you're not reaching them in other ways, often, they're not considering those voices. So sometimes the organizations who serve Hoosiers have the best opportunity to help relay, if not represent, some of those interests. In addition, you see here the third bullet that when we advocate together, we have one strong voice to represent the sector. And that's another thing that is really important is we need to make sure that our voices are coming together and are a strong, united voice, and that we're reaching all throughout the state. And we will talk about that later in the series, especially as we'll talk about ways to make sure that our voices are resonating with legislators, how to find them, how to make sure that we're matching the message. But so let's talk a little bit more about why 2026 in particular, it's really important to advocate. So it's legislators' time is always crunched, and there's a lot of demands, a lot of people coming to them with a lot of asks on a lot of topics. But in particular, we're finding that in this session of the General Assembly, this is a short session already. This is a non-budget year, so typically they start in early January and they end about mid-March. Well, as you may remember, this session technically started back in December with the redistricting discussion. And because of that, they've decided to shorten the session to the end of February. So believe it or not, we're almost to the halfway point technically in this session. It Apologies to those who are joining us by video at some point in the future, but we are at January 23rd, 2026 when we're recording this. Next week is about that midpoint. So there's a lot of bills that are going to die because they're not going to advance. There's also a lot of issues that are really important and have a lot of impact on Hoosiers' lives that are barreling forward, but yet haven't had a lot of input from the people who would be affected the most. So the second bullet you have there is without that united voice, legislators are going to lean on special interest lobbyists and their peers. And so they're going to rely on the the contract lobbyists who are the regulars in the hallways of the Senate and the folks who can afford to hire them, and or they're going to rely on what their colleagues, their fellow House and Senate members are telling them. And so it is even more important for us to be able to get in front of them. And so there are some really massive policy changes that are happening right now. You'll see some of those in the weekly legislative email that we send to our members with intel about the bills that we are working on. You'll see it in news media coverage. There are bills that could affect criminalization of homelessness that's moving forward. There's bills that would greatly affect how we deal with categorical eligibility for SNAP and Medicaid that would get rid of that categorical eligibility. Those are big policy shifts that would have a lot of impact on the work that our members do. Those bills are moving. And right now, I think that our legislators haven't heard enough from us. And as you see there, if we aren't at the table, we're on the menu. So those are the stakes of why lobbying and advocacy is more important. So let's get to the discussion about what the rules are, at least some guidelines. So we're going to start with some really high level ideas, and then we're going to get to some specifics as well. And I will say throughout my discussion, go ahead, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And then we'll come to a place toward the end of this next section is going to be kind of like the big section. So let's see what questions we have, and we'll address them all as a group at the end, because we may get some themes of what people want to talk the most about. So let's start with some really high-level overviews. And something that we'll repeat this in a couple of ways throughout this next section, but want to make clear that nonprofits can and should advocate. As we've said, if you're not part of that discussion, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So you need to find a way for your voice to be part of the decision-making process. So it's critical that we're informing that policy change, and on behalf of our clients and our most vulnerable communities who often can't be part of that, even as we try to find ways to bring their voices directly into the process. So in order to effectively advocate, nonprofits need to know what those rules are. We need to know what counts as education versus lobbying versus electioneering and what they can and can't do. And we will touch on some of that today. And I'll give you some additional resources for some of the pieces that don't fit into 1 hour discussion. And then ultimately, nonprofits, what we want to empower you to do is to feel comfortable and confident so that you can get the most out of the advocating and lobbying that you do. All right. This is a slide that I've come up with, which is about as high level, but this is a good like rule of thumb and something to think about. All nonprofits can do education, and we're going to talk about what that means versus lobbying. So think of that as your green light. You can always educate policymakers on the impact of certain issues and what's affecting the people that you work with. And we'll talk about later, what makes things, lobbying is often when you're adding an ass to it. And we'll put some meat on those bones here in a sec. So, green light, education. You should build a relationship with your legislators. We'll talk about that in Advocacy 201. But once you have that relationship, or if you have something important to say on a topic, you can always educate them. Lobbying is where it's, I say, a yellow light. You can move forward, but you need to know the rules. You need to know when you can make a move, and you need to be cautious about that. But most nonprofits can lobby as long as they are following those rules. A few exceptions are there are some cases where some nonprofits are directly receiving funding, and often some of that are federal and state funding. You cannot use that funding for your lobbying, and we'll talk about where to find some of those rules. And then what I'm calling for today a red light is electioneering. And that's taking part or encouraging others to take part in an election campaign, endorsing candidates, things like that. I think, at least in terms of our discussion today, we're not going to talk more about that. Actually, we will come back after session and we will talk more about ways, not necessarily like what is electioneering versus what is educating the members of the public and candidates. So we're not going to get into that world today, but let's consider that as a rule of thumb to be a red light. Okay. So nobody raised their hand and said that they saw Advocacy 101 last year. And so therefore, some of what I'm going to talk about next is going to be new to you. But what I encourage you to do is the past few years when we've done this version of Advocacy 101, we've brought in an actual lobbying lawyer who is an expert in the law and who could give legal advice. I encourage folks to watch last year's video that's on Prosperity Indiana's YouTube page. Now, turn us out and walk away now, because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the highlights from that discussion, and then we're going to weave them into a conversation in a Q&A about matching the why into the how. But I do want to give all credit for the next slides to Alan Madison. He's of the law firm Trister, Ross, Shadler, and Gold. He does a really excellent training, and I encourage you, if you want to do a training from a nonprofit lobbying expert, he's your guy. And so we're going to take some of the best that he told us. So what we want to think about in terms of our goals is we want to talk about what is lobbying. We talked about education versus lobbying. We're going to find out exactly what some of those rules are. Then really the conversation shifts to planning strategically so that you can get the biggest bang for your buck, and then apply that to a few real world examples. And so Alan's photo here is going up to the toe of the line. And he talks about a lot of our, for nonprofits, if you're a 501c3, you may get grant funding and you may be asked to do certain things with that. And the people who fund that want you to get the most out of that. You often can't use funding from other charitable grants for lobbying, but we want to talk about what that lobbying is and how to come close to that line. And there are ways that you can then use funding for non-lobbying marketing purposes, for education purposes, so that when you are lobbying, you're getting the most out of that. That's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. Okay, so specifically, 501c3 charities may lobby, but not with restricted grants. They can conduct a limited amount of lobbying. They need to make sure that they're following the rules about reporting that. And then private foundations may not directly pay for lobbying. So foundations, if they're giving grants, that funding, the law says that that cannot be used for lobbying. Um, and many of those foundations prohibit it from lobbying. So you need to be able to make sure that um, you're not lobbying with those funds, but you're being able to use it in ways that can set up advocacy and education in other ways. Let's see here. There are rules that go along with this. This is the really technical part that we're not going to get into today, but as a follow-up, we're going to send you resources about this. And this gets into how you are setting yourselves up in terms of how you are reporting your lobbying. And there's something known as the 501H rules. This gets into how you are structuring yourselves in terms of how you are doing that reporting. And we will follow up and give that to you. But again, for this conversation today, we're really getting you to think about wanting to make sure that you are comfortable with the aspect of education and lobbying itself, and then you'll get the rules about how to do the reporting. There are also specific rules that come with congressional and state level advocacy. Um, Indiana law says that both legislative and executive branch are covered as lobbying, but that grassroots lobbying has a narrow definition. And we'll send you the resources there about where the Indiana rules come into play. But in a bigger picture, let's step back then and talk about what is lobbying. And there are two main types of lobbying. There's direct lobbying, communicating with lawmakers, and then there's grassroots lobbying, which is communicating with the public in order to influence lawmakers. And I want to state again that what I'm giving you here is a high level overview of some of these materials. I encourage you to go back and, when you're interested, to see there are some details underneath this that we don't have time to cover today, but I do want to give you the high level picture. So there's those two types: direct lobbying, grassroots lobbying. So what is direct lobbying? It has three key elements. All right, so direct lobbying with a lawmaker in front of you has to meet these three elements: that it's a direct communication with the legislator or their staff. That's one. Number two, it's on a specific piece of legislation. So it has, a bill number, it's a piece of live legislation that you're talking about, not simply a general topic or issue. And then third aspect of direct lobbying is that it reflects your organization's view on that legislation. So it's not direct lobbying unless all three of those pieces are in play. So here's an example, a communication directly with legislators or staff. So that's that first piece. So this could include a face-to-face meeting with the legislator or staff. This is when you're meeting with them in their office, or it doesn't have to be at their office. It could be at a coffee shop, but you are right in front of them, or you are in that meeting over Zoom, or through a letter, email, or phone call, but you are directly communicating with the legislator staff. That's the key piece. So that's number one. Number two, on specific legislation. So bills that have been introduced is the big piece. That's where you have your number, SB 285, for example, an introduced piece of legislation. If you're talking with them about that bill, it can also apply to specific legislative proposals that are not yet introduced. And I think this is where you want a legislator to introduce a specific legislation, and you're asking them to do that. We'll talk that ask is the third piece, but that's where a not yet introduced piece can come into play. It can also include appropriations bills and ballot measures. Indiana, we don't deal with ballot measures so much because we really only have on the ballot constitutional changes. So unlike other states where they're voting on specific ballot changes, we don't have to worry about that here. And then on specific legislation, it does not, though, include general policy discussions. So if you want to talk with your legislator about the issue of homelessness in general, or even if you want to talk with your legislator about the criminalization of homelessness, if you're talking about that general issue, but you're not attaching or bringing into the conversation Senate Bill 285, a bill that has to do with the criminalization of homelessness, then that's not lobbying. Now, there may be reasons why you would want to for it to be lobbying, but there may be reasons where you want to do the education, especially if it's timing. If you're not during session, you may not need to bring up a specific piece of legislation because there's no ask to it. And so therefore you're talking with them just about homelessness and what the implications of criminalization would be. And that's where lobbying, you are not having a lobbying discussion. It's also not talking about specific legislation if you're talking about regulatory or executive actions. So, that is a realm of talking about administrative policy is not considered specific legislation. Um, for these purposes. Also, we're not talking about school or zoning board decisions. That's not counted as legislation. And then, as you see here, corporate or institutional actions such as things that affect churches, hospitals, universities, community centers. Those may be like small p policies, but they don't count for specific legislation in this case. So this is an example that was given last year. You can see this is a tweet that was put out by Prosperity Indiana. And this was to recap a meeting that Prosperity Indiana and some of our members had with HAND Incorporated from Hamilton County, with a member of Congresswoman Victoria Sparks' staff. So this was, we were showing off a new affordable housing development up in Hamilton County. And we were talking about, as you see here, we were thanking the staff for talking about uh, that new division would provide 6 affordable housing units. And we put that in the context of what the need for the county is. And then we were saying in this tweet, Congress should protect and expand housing assistance for our vulnerable families. So we'll talk about some other examples in the future, but I want to share with you here that even though we're meeting directly with the Congresswoman's staff, we were not talking in this communication about any specific legislation. So that's what kept this particular piece of communication from being something that you'd have to count as lobbying. So here, sharing the photos, having that discussion about affordable housing, the people who were there doing that, none of that was lobbying. Now, I will share that later on, there was a specific ask that I made to the Congresswoman's staffer. So I did some lobbying, and that's what we're going to talk about here in a second, but wanted to show you that everything up to here, you had that line with the sneakers. We're going up to that line, but nobody who is doing simply that was lobbying. Now, here's this distinction with grassroots lobbying. So we've been talking specifically about the direct lobbying where you're meeting right in front of a lawmaker and their staff. This is that second form of lobbying, grassroots lobbying. So this has 4 elements. So it has a communication, number one, which is either to the public, and it can include, tweets, advertisements, speeches. The form is a immaterial, but to the public is. So it's number one, a communication. Number two, on specific legislation, like we've talked about. Number three, that reflects that organization's view. And then fourth, includes a call to action for the public. So that is the distinction. When you're direct lobbying, you're right in front of Senator Young or Congresswoman Sparks or your state legislator, and you're asking them to do something that follows your view on legislation. Here we're talking about you're talking to the public and you're asking them to take the action on a specific piece of legislation. So that is that key piece, is that you're including a call to action. It's the key distinction between grassroots and direct lobbying. Call to action asks the audience to contact their legislator. And here the example, call Senator Smith and let them know to vote yes on, this and this bill. So that's the key distinction. Um, Then let's talk about ways that you could. So we've talked about the two big forms of lobbying, direct and grassroots. This is where you can think about how to strategically plan your activities so that you're getting the most out of advocacy and you're minimizing the amount of actual lobbying that would need to be billed to something that's not coming from a foundation that comes from a general fund. So you can think about ways to prepare for lobbying as lobbying costs. So the key thing to think about is that activities whose only purpose is to prepare for lobbying must be paid for with lobbying dollars, with unrestricted funds versus restricted funds that come from those foundation grants that cannot be used for lobbying. So some examples of what would be considered lobbying cost are meetings for to set lobbying strategy, where you're specifically talking about the lobbying work itself. So you have to count those meetings as lobbying cost. Another example is polling that you will use only for lobbying. And then third is writing handouts used only in lobbying. So even from what we're saying here, does anybody have any ideas about how you could reduce lobbying costs for some of the examples of activities that we're talking about here? Any thoughts? And for this, like feel free to come off mute and just shout it out. Any ideas about how you could reduce lobbying costs for these?
So if you could, any of these things you're doing, if you use it for more purposes than only lobbying, you use the same poster for an educational purposes in addition to using it for lobbying, then that allows you to use the cost, um, other expenses. Is that right?
You're on the right track, and thank you. I wanted to get that type of sentiment, and let me show you something of what that ways that we can do that. So there's a little bit more to it, but let's talk about an example. So here's an example of what's not lobbying. So this is using the subsequent use rule. So a non-lobbying communication that is first distributed broadly to the public can then later be used as part of a lobbying effort. That's very much along the lines of what you're saying. So this can include reports, fact sheets, or op-eds that you can mention legislation, but not with the call to action. And so this is a good example here that Alan found. This is a report from our partners at the Indiana Justice Project and also the Notre Dame Law School, their eviction law clinic. They put out this report in, I think, summer of 2024, talking about Indiana's record sealing law, and it included some recommendations. And so it was in part an academic report, but it also had some policy recommendations. But what it did not have was a call to action. It did in no place, it talked about Indiana's the record sealing, what it did do, what it did well, some holes, and then some recommendations. But what it didn't say was, reader, reach out to your legislator and ask them to do these things. But because it was a really well-written report, we were able to later use it as in part of our advocacy conversations. So you might remember last session, we were able to strengthen Indiana's eviction ceiling law. And in part, there were meetings that I was in where I had this report and I was pointing to some of its findings, but that didn't mean that the report and the writing of the report had to be counted as lobbying. Now, my time sitting in front of the legislator, because I was asking them to vote on Senate Bill 142, that meeting time was lobbying, but not the report itself. Same with, as he says, reports, fact sheets, op-eds that you write about the legislation, but without that call to action. That's the critical piece when it comes to grassroots lobbying. Here's another example, and this is something that can be really important for if you're with a nonprofit and you're not at a place like you're wanting still to keep a yardstick between you and anything that sniffs of lobbying. You can still provide oral or written technical assistance in response to a written request by a government body, legislative committee, or subcommittee. And so, again, sometimes you can be asked to testify or provide written opinion, And that's not going to be lobbying, especially you're not going to have the ask in it, but it can have you're providing your technical assistance. So, for example, a lot of members of legal services, um, because of the national group that they're part of, receive some congressional funding, they cannot do lobbying. But I've been in hearings at the State House where a legislator has asked them to come and testify. Now, there are some other specifications we're not going to get into today, like it has to be a written request and it has to come from a legislator on a specific topic. But that's an area in which an organization can provide their expertise, and it's not lobbying. All right. So now let's talk a little bit. So this is kind of the fun part where I'm going to ask you to give me your opinion about some particular scenarios. So this is one. This is me here. I'm with Senator Todd Young, and I'm going to tell you, two different things that are happening. So number one, I am showing him here. This is at his office in Washington, D.C., or it's in a room in the basement of the Capitol, actually. I'm showing him a letter that was written that collates experiences of Prosperity Indiana members and their experiences of seeing cuts that came from the federal DOGE program. I'm telling him about some examples of organizations that have had to lay off members of their staff due to cuts, or examples where grants from the federal government were cut and the impact that that had on their ability to do work. So my question for you is, first of all, is that lobbying or not lobbying? And if it is lobbying, is it direct or grassroots? And so Scott already has a response. I want to see a couple more here. So let me give you a second. So again, as you're thinking about it, I'm talking with Senator Young. I'm showing him this letter, several pages long, that collates and relays the experience of Prosperity Indiana members and how cuts at the federal level have impacted their work. Is it direct or grassroots lobbying, or is it not lobbying? See a couple more typing in here. Okay, I'm seeing people are saying it's not lobbying. Does anybody want to come off mute and venture to explain your vote? Why is this not lobbying? All right, so Mary Jane says, because it's not specific legislation and I'm sharing the experience of our members. Yeah, that's right. So that's one thing. There's no specific legislation that we're talking about here. We're sharing experiences. And the other thing is there's no call to action. I'm not asking him to take a direct action. Now we're sharing that those cuts are hurting nonprofits in Indiana and the Hoosiers they serve for sure. All right, now, a few seconds after this, then there's another sheet underneath that that I'm delivering to him a sign-on sheet, a sign-on letter from Prosperity Indiana members and members of our Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition that is asking him to reintroduce his Eviction Crisis Act and the Family Stability and Opportunities Vouchers Act. Is that lobbying or not lobbying? Is it direct or grassroots? So again, the next piece of paper under there is that I'm delivering to him a sign-on letter that's asking him to reintroduce the Eviction Crisis Act and the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. And I see, so a couple of people are here, direct lobbying because there's a specific ask. Yes. And it's direct and not grassroots. Maybe this is obvious because I'm directly talking to the legislator himself here. Okay, very good. So you folks are getting this. All right, let me show you a couple more examples. So this right here is this is an active action alert that we have on Prosperity Indiana's website right now. And it says here, there's a couple elements, and this isn't all of it, but this is part of it. There's this graphic. No one should be locked up for being homeless. Tell your state legislators no on Senate Bill 285. please go ahead and put your feedback in the chat, or feel free to come off mute. And then here you have there's some explanation. Legislation to force local law enforcement to criminalize homelessness could be up for a final vote in the Indiana Senate within days. And then there's the button, and then underneath that, there's some more explanation. All right, and I see here grassroots lobbying. All right, you guys are getting this. Okay, very good. And so, yeah, this is grassroots lobbying. This is where we are sending this email out and we are mentioning the legislation. We are talking about our view on it, and we are giving an ask to the public to contact their legislators to take a specific action. We're saying, so this has all the classic elements. This says all of that. It says vote no. And so, yeah, this is about as clear of grassroots lobbying as you can get. And so I am not on this call asking you to take action right now. And so, therefore, what I'm doing, I do not consider to be lobbying right now, because I am not directly asking you to take an action on this bill that could be up for a final vote in the Senate this coming as soon as Tuesday. I'm just
Andrew,
sharing that
question.
information with you. Yes, go ahead.
So I just sent a letter to a newspaper yesterday on this exact legislation. And I said in that what I thought about it. I'd have to go back and look at my letter, but I don't believe that I said, hey, all of you out there, please call your senators and say that you're against it. I didn't have an ask. So now I wonder what category that letter is in.
To me, and that's one thing, and we should have talked about this a little more ahead of time. And so, Scott, if you're acting as an individual, frankly, that is different. Like, individuals are not asked to register, or you're not billing time to restricted or unrestricted foundation funds. And so, technically, I think from what you're telling me, it sounds like you are not necessarily grassroots lobbying because you don't have that ask at the end. That's my read on the situation without seeing the text. But
Okay, but
again,
I was speaking my own opinion as well. I wasn't represent, I'm not part of an official nonprofit or anything like that. It's really more speaking as an individual.
I'm glad you highlighted this, and this actually makes me think when we do this again next time, I should talk earlier about the distinction between individual and volunteer actions, and then what you're doing as part of a 501c3 organization that you are employed by and funded by. And that is part of the key thing. A lot of what we're talking about with the sneakers coming up to the line, it really is about what can you do with restricted funding. All of the stuff we're talking about as an individual you can do, and I say you should do. You should be lobbying your heart out as an individual and as a volunteer, and you can do all this stuff. Really, the restrictions come to when you are employed and when you have to file as a lobbyist. And frankly, the filing as a lobbyist, like those rules, that's what we're not really getting into right now. We are not assuming anybody here is going to like be moonlighting as a professional lobbyist that they need to register on their own. That's just a little beyond what we're talking about. But again, to your question, Scott, like I think that what you're telling me, it probably doesn't quite count as grassroots lobbying because it doesn't have that ask. Let me show folks, I've got a couple more examples, and then we're going to open it back up to Q&A, and then we'll have some next steps to talk about. Oh, let's see here. What did we do? All right. So here's another example. I know this print is kind of small, but this is another example that Alan, he did a good job, like went through kind of like our website and pulled up. So here is a fact sheet from the Indiana Asset and Opportunity Network. And if you're not familiar with that, Rachel will tell you about it in a few minutes, but that is Prosperity Indiana's. We convene, it is it's basically a coalition that's all about economic opportunity. And so this is a fact sheet that we have. So here's a question. Is this lobbying? Is it direct or grassroots, or is it not lobbying? We've got a response from Lori. Anybody else want to give folks a chance to put your marker down, and then we'll see what you think. Okay, so we've got one grassroots lobbying, we've got a couple of not lobbying, and so Rachel, I know you're on staff, but let me ask you to explain your answer here, because actually you got it right.
Yeah, so I think this is one of those things where the creation of this was not lobbying in and of itself. It falls into that kind of education category, which is in itself lobbying, but you could obviously take this document to a conversation with a lawmaker about a bill to expand or, alter the child tax credit in some way. But that would be kind of its own activity, and the creation of this document wouldn't necessarily have to be billed as lobbying.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right. So this is actually was held up as this is a good example of how you can, would be education and it would be informative, but because it does not have an ask on it, it and it's not mentioning individual senators or representatives, it's not targeted specifically toward them. It could just simply be a fact sheet, and it is a fact sheet. And the other key distinction you remember was if this was published and circulated widely before it is used for lobbying. And the rule of thumb that I've talked about is like, yes, technically, like let's say you publish it and you publish it because you make it a live link on your website, but it's hidden somewhere. Is that really the spirit of what the law is talking about? Depending on who's asking, it may or may not be. But if this is something where you are, prominently, displaying it as you do other fact sheets, or it is something you're using widely with your membership, or, like we're sending it to the ANO network or doing a webinar about it, and then later if we're using that same document when we're talking with our congressional delegation, then it's not we don't have to worry about the creation of the fact sheet itself as being lobbying. We simply have to make sure that the time we're using to for the meeting with the legislator with the ask that's direct lobbying and that we're using non-restricted funds for that. So this is again, that's that example of like getting the most bang for your buck. So if there are ways that you can create brochures or reports about the work that you do and how important it is to your community, then you have something that's on hand that should you ever need to talk to a legislator, and then even if you're attaching into that conversation an ask for a specific piece of legislation, the creation of that content itself is not lobbying. So that's a distinction there. Okay, this is our last example. This one's kind of tricky. Um, I want you to take a look at this one. So it's on the same topic as the one before. And so the question here is, lobbying or not lobbying? And if it's lobbying, is it grassroots or is it direct? Okay, I've got one response saying not lobbying because there's no direct ask. Agreed, no specific ask. And so I will point folks back if you watch this on Alan's webinar last year, he says actually this is lobbying. He says this is direct lobbying because it does mention a bill and because we've tagged the senators there that is a direct contact. In addition, we're giving our opinion, and even though it's kind of maybe not the most forceful ask saying we hope to add them to the list of those who vote for the bill, that those have enough elements that, in doing, if you're constructing a communication like this, that would, be right about the line, but you'd probably be better off counting your time creating this tweet as direct lobbying because it does meet those elements. But as people could see this, like if you didn't want to do that, you could probably remove a few of those elements and still communicate about the bill. And you could raise awareness by tagging legislators, but you'd want to make sure that there's no ask or you're not sharing a viewpoint on this specific piece of legislation. There's other ways to do that. But this is a good example of where there's the elements that come together to get all together. Okay, so we showed a few examples. I want to make sure to bring us home here before the end of the hour. So if nothing else, here's a couple of key takeaways for you. So one, talking with a legislator about general policy is not lobbying. So if nothing else, if you're still kind of unsure and you don't want to tread too far in because you're not yet comfortable, just know that talking to a legislator in general about policy, about education policy, about housing policy, about tax credit policy, that is not lobbying. And sharing the experience of your clients, how an existing law is affecting your clients, that's not lobbying. It's not. Then materials that reflect a view on legislation without a call to action are not lobbying if they are distributed broadly to the public before being provided to legislators. And so there's that example again of it can have a view on legislation. It can talk about how Indiana's eviction ceiling law or even a proposed piece of legislation would affect the people that you work with. But if it doesn't have that call to action, it's not lobbying if, it's not the first time that you're using it is not in that conversation with the legislator. If you've distributed it broadly, to the public and to, your typical audience. Okay, so those are a few things to take away. All right, so I know this is a tip of an iceberg when it comes to all the things that you could know about education and lobbying. And I do want to share with you a few additional resources. So as I mentioned, like we're not attorneys, but we know some. And we have a few resources. Our advocacy FAQ page has a few additional things. It has a sheet about how a bill becomes a law. It has some more kind of like general practices about education and advocacy and lobbying. I encourage folks get in touch with Alan if you really want the in-depth and if you want like a legal advice. You can hire him as your lawyer if you would like to. Another resource is the Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy Project. They also do trainings. They also have information and resources on their site. And I do want to make sure that you're aware that they have free technical assistance for some of these basic questions. Is this lobbying? Is that not? How do I deal with this or that? They have a technical assistance portal on their site. And again, you'll get a copy of this. But they also have even a phone line. 866 NP Lobby, nonprofit lobby. You can call them up if if you have a question about something coming up in real time. And then finally, I wanted to make sure to give you a link to the Indiana Lobby Registration Commission. And so that is, again, it's a little bit beyond what we're talking about today. But if you're taking that step where your organization is considering, if you're at that place to register as a lobbyist and have to report your hours, et cetera, that has all the rules. And there are some resources there, including their lobbyist handbook and their informal advice to lobbyist sheet. Those are good things to look at if you're starting to get close to that point. Okay, and so with that, I know we have some questions here. Actually, Rachel, let's have you talk about next steps because I'd hate for people to miss that, and then we'll address FAQ or we'll address questions and we'll keep going as long as we need to.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll try to run through this pretty quick so folks with questions can ask those without us bleeding over too much on time. So I'm going to go quick, but it's just because I want you to have time to ask your questions. So this is part of a three-part series. Our next installment, Advocacy 201, is going to take place next week at the same time. And I definitely encourage you to attend that one. That's going to be a really exciting one. We have a panel of people who have been involved in advocacy in Indiana for several years. So we have a panel of experts, but these are also experts with a lot of localized experience and a lot of really good history and context for, who are the lawmakers that we've been able to engage with? What's the progress that we've made? What are the issues where we've really been able to gain some ground in Indiana? And it's really inspiring to hear these people talk. So I definitely want you to attend all sessions of the series, and I'm glad you came today. But if you or a colleague, are able to make that next session, I do really think it's going to be very impactful, and I encourage you to attend. The final installment of the series takes place on February 6th, and that is Advocacy 301. And that's where we provide a little bit more tactical support on, this is the process for scheduling a meeting with your representative's legislative assistant. And this is how you can structure a meeting to get your message across and make it impactful in the short time that you have, because we never get an hour with our lawmakers. We get maybe 10, 15 minutes. And we want to be able to support you in making your ask as concise and powerful and impactful as possible, so you really get the most out of those meetings. And all of this leads up to Prosperity Indiana's State House Day, which takes place on February 12th. And we have a brief prep call earlier that week. So we can talk to you about the logistics of parking. We can let you know what snacks we're going to have. And we can talk about the legislation that we're really going to be prioritizing as we reach out to lawmakers that day. So if you haven't signed up for the rest of the series or for State House Day, we encourage you to do so. If you liked today, or you think one of your colleagues will really like 201, please feel free to share out the registration pages, because again, this series is available to any member of the public who wants to be advocating for the issues that really matter to us, our communities, and the people that we serve. So that's kind of the event preview for the rest of this series. And again, please join us for State House Day, because we want to be showing up and showing strong to our lawmakers on that day. And then lastly, I also wanted to let you know, I am kind of I don't want to say the leader of the coalitions, right? But I play a strong and supportive role to all of our coalitions. We have one focused on housing, one focused on kind of consumer protection, and then another one that's really focused on, financial empowerment and financial capability. So if any of those coalitions are of interest to you, please just take note of the QR codes here on this page, and feel free to come back to this when we send out the slides after the fact. These are statewide coalitions where service providers and individuals can join and really keep their fingers on the pulse of legislation impacting these issue areas. So you will get a lot of issue education. You will be alerted to opportunities to encourage your lawmakers to vote yes and no on positive and harmful legislation, respectively. And so please just consider joining our coalitions. Joining is not a huge lift. It is mostly signing up for email updates, but then there are opportunities to get more involved with those coalitions if you're a member for a while and you decide that's a step you want to take, either in a personal or a professional capacity. So those are our coalitions. My email address will be on one of the final slides in this presentation. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me and I will answer them as best I can. And we really hope that this is kind of a first touch with Prosperity Indiana and our advocacy work. We hope that you will join with us and stay with us for the long haul, because the policy landscape is always evolving and always changing, and we want you there with us. So I think lastly, we will go ahead and kick it back to Andrew for any questions that you have. Am I right on that, or is there one more slide?
No, I think that's right. I'll keep it on this for now. We'll go back and hit some of the questions from the chat. Happy to take others that people have. The one thing I just want to underline what Rachel mentioned about State House Day. I will say, for anybody here, as you sat through this and we were talking about the rules, and the rules kind of sound restrictive, and like, if you're, well, I don't know if I can do this, and am I gonna, cross all my T's and dot my I's. I encourage everybody, if you're new to this, come join us on State House Day. with no expectation, like we're not going to require you to do lobbying or advocacy. If you're ready to, we'd love to have you sign up, and we'll include you when we're working to schedule meetings with legislators from your region. But if nothing else, there is something about being in the state house, seeing it in person, and even just kind of witnessing the layout of the physical structure of the building. And even if you are with a group and you are observing some of the discussions with legislators, I've had people later say that was a really helpful experience. And now I feel like I can do this. I never knew that I would be comfortable, but like after seeing it, yeah, I saw how people share their stories. So the rest of this Advocacy 101, the 201 and 301 are trying to give you some of that preparation, but coming in person is really key. So let me go back. I'm going to look at the questions that we had in the chat and happy to take any others that people had. So let's see what we've got here. So I'm starting back from the beginning and see what people say. So, have a few here. So it sounds like if I say I support this, it's educating. If I say I want you to vote in this way, it's lobbying. I think that's decent as a rule of thumb. Again, part of the thinking about the distinction is if you are acting as an employee or as a representative of an incorporated organization. I think especially like if you're an employee and not just like a volunteer, that's where you need to be thinking about like, are you endorsing and you're having a direct call to action? You're asking for a specific act if it's direct lobbying. If you're a volunteer or a member, just the public, you're likely, you're not doing grassroots lobbying really. And if you are, then like you're just doing that as a private citizen. So, you're not billing that to anything. A second one here, if I'm stating my opinion about a piece of legislation, but I'm not speaking for an organization, is that lobbying? Okay, that's exactly what we're talking about. So if you're as an opinion on your own, you may be lobbying, but you are not bound to the type of rules that we're talking about. Um, let's see. Let's go through here, see what else we have. Question for the discussion. I'm a board member of a nonprofit, but am not paid for being on the board. Am I still an individual since I'm not paid? So I want to say this is not legal advice. And so, we may want to double check with the organization of which you're on the board, because there are, organizations may have organizational policies and norms for their board members. And I don't want to run afoul of that. But I think it still comes down to it's how you are using your time. And frankly, Scott, if you are, retired and you're doing this on your own time, again, you're not billing to anything. And so it's more about your relationship with that organization. And even if you are lobbying on behalf of that, you're not necessarily reporting that because you're not doing it full time. It's not getting to a place where you would need to register as a lobbyist with the state. So again, that's my impression. Don't want to, that it's not legal advice. I would say go back to the organization that you're volunteering for, but that's my take. There's a question here. Is Hand a member of the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition? Hand is a Prosperity Indiana member, and I believe that they are signed up as a Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition member. They've worked with that coalition in the past. I'm pretty sure there are, but I'd ask Andrea just to double check. Yeah. All right. So that's what I've got in terms of written questions. Let me open it up to the group. What other questions do people have?
Andrew, I'm curious if somebody is feeling perhaps I don't want to say muzzled, that's a little too aggressive, but if an organization's board leadership is saying we can't do that, how would you encourage executive leadership to gently correct them and kind of provide those guidelines on there are certain things we cannot do, but we can be posting on social media about the impact of legislation. We can be, X, Y, and Z, because there's there's the rules, but then there's also those kind of norms and dynamics that you referred to earlier.
Mm-hmm.
How would you encourage leadership in an organization to try to course correct if their ship is unnecessarily constrained?
I'm glad you mentioned that. And that's in part why we like to hold these, because we want to, we want to share what the actual rules are, and also want to make sure, if it got to a point of, if you're an organizational leader and you're working with your board, those are internal dynamics. And, like you gotta educate, but also be responsive to what the board's priorities are, because they are the legal leadership of that organization. Um, but I think it could certainly help to have this type of training, and maybe bring in a Boulder Advocacy or an Allen Madison and do that type of training with a board to really understand the legal nuts and bolts. If you're getting to that point with an organization and a board, I would recommend that kind of thing. I think it's also important, though, sometimes we'll run across members who will say, like, well, I can't lobby because I'm a nonprofit. And that's where, like, well, wait. That's where we need to have the really basic discussion of, yes, nonprofits can and should lobby. They need to know the rules. There may be other reasons, though. It may be that, they're a nonprofit, but they're working, or that person's role may be working almost exclusively with restricted funds. And so within that role, they may not currently have an opportunity to be able to build to unrestricted funds. And there may be also some, cases where there are, frankly, political considerations that they are working under. And so that's a process. I wouldn't want to just charge in and say, like, no, I know the rules and we can do this. I think that's a part of the broader world of advocacy, is you're advocating not just with legislators, but within your leadership and within your sector, and making sure that you are working to the betterment of your organization, your mission, and the people you serve. So all that it's complicated, but I think that hopefully the discussion that we've started today and some of the resources that we shared can help bring people down that road. Any other questions?
One of the newer members of Prosperity Indiana's advocacy team has also joined us. That was my cat.
Oh, well, that's great. Thanks, everybody. I don't want to hold people longer. We're already about 9 minutes past the original time. Really appreciate everybody's participation and questions. Hope to see you the next 3 Fridays for 201, 301, and then, of course, State House Day. And please do. We want to fill that gallery, especially on February 12th. So please encourage your contacts to join us for these next few dates. And you can join us on State House Day without doing the next two. It's just you'll be better informed if you do. So with that, thanks everybody. Happy Friday and weekend. See you next Friday. Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
all so much for coming, everyone. We hope to see you next week.